This is a historic occasion for you. It's the first time you've ever had a lecture from a philosopher with a black eye. And I don't know quite how I got it, except I woke up Sunday morning and what's now blackish was very red. And I think I must have gotten an insect bite that hit a capillary. And coupled with the fact that I'm temporarily on blood thinners, I think that's what did it. But it was a very strange sight when I went to shave. Now, I'm going to make a full length. What I'm going to be doing today is something I don't like to do when I teach, which is just to read. And the reason for that is when you just read something, it takes about half as long as when you elaborate things from notes. And we don't have that much time. But I will make a full-length copy of this available to Roopen, and any of you who want to look at it again can do that. Okay, so to begin, when scientists want to understand the species mouse, they study a few mice. When they want to understand the class of falling objects, they make a few experiments. Instead of studying isolated examples of a species, why not just study the species? And the answer, obviously, is that you can't see a species. You can only see individuals. Individuals are examples of species, but we perceive individuals and species in opposite ways. And this is very important for Plato. So I hope I can do a good screen sharing. How is that?
Good.
Okay, it's not what I was looking for, though. Let me try again. That's it. Okay. So we perceive individuals and species in opposite ways. We can perceive species with our mind, but not with our eyes. For example, we can define human nature. For example, a human being is the rational animal, but we can't see human nature. On the other hand, we can perceive individuals with our eyes, but not with our mind. And that might be a more difficult one to grasp. We can't perceive them with our mind because we can't define an individual. And the reason for that is that a definition must apply only to the thing defined, and it must always apply to it. Only a triangle is a closed figure consisting of 3 straight lines and 3 angles. So there's nothing else that you can say that about. And it is always a closed figure consisting of 3 straight lines and 3 angles. It's not going to change in a couple of years. But nothing you can say about one individual can't also be true of some other individual. So individuals don't meet the first criterion for definition. And since individuals constantly change, nothing you can say about one will always be true. So they don't meet the second criterion for definition. Therefore, we can't perceive individuals with our mind the way we perceive objects. And this brings us to Plato's famous theory of forms. Okay, another word for species is universal. For example, dog is a universal because the term applies to innumerable individuals. And that's what a universal is, something that applies to innumerable individuals. And Plato's word for a universal is a form. Surprisingly, Plato believes that forms are more real than things. And I'll give you a little syllogism. First premise, because only forms can be defined, for reason, only forms are real. Premise two, reasoning is more reliable than the senses, because the senses often deceive us. Therefore, we should follow reason and regard the forms as more real than things. Similarly, 200 years ago, the great German philosopher Hegel wrote, "The real is the rational, and the rational is the real." Individuals, he said, are mere existence. So this is a view that isn't just Plato's view, but has been the view of many philosophers up to the 21st century. Forms also manifest the nature of goodness. That's the other major component of the theory of forms. Our first premise, since the forms are knowable by reason, they are rational. Second premise, rationality is good. To be irrational is bad. You know, we use the term that way all the time. If we say you're being irrational, that's a bad thing. Be reasonable, that's a good thing. So, conclusion, the forms manifest the nature of goodness. They are manifestations of a higher form that Plato calls the form of the good. So the forms are images, that is, examples of the good, and individual things are images, that is, examples of the forms. That's why we can study the species or form of mouse by looking only at individual mice. So if you start at the bottom with things, they will help you understand the form, and understanding the forms will eventually help you understand what goodness is. Now, Plato's most famous illustration of the theory of forms is the allegory of the cave. It comes at the beginning of Book 7, where Socrates, Plato's narrator, compares us to prisoners in a cave. And I got this from YouTube, and it's a very good illustration. Much better than a lot of the others on YouTube. So here's what Plato says. Here's what Socrates says. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them. So you can see them on the left side of the wall, sitting with their backs to the wall. Because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on a higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path, a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers, above which they show their puppets. Also imagine that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it. Statues of people and other animals made out of stone, wood, and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. If their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them, don't you think they'd believe that the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? Okay, so this next part is my summary. If you freed a prisoner and turned them around to look at the puppets in the fire, they wouldn't be able to see them. They'd be blinded by the light because their eyes are accustomed to the dark. So if you told them that these things, that is, the puppets and the fire, were more real than the shadows, they wouldn't believe you. And this is a metaphor for our difficulty in believing that universals are more real than things. Okay, so now, suppose the prisoners are forced out of the cave into the sunlight. So they go past the fire and up the long path to the mouth of the cave and into the sunlight. At first, they'd be blinded by it, just as they were by the fire. They would be able to see only gradually. First, they could see shadows. Then, as their eyes got more accustomed to the light, reflections in the water. Then things on the ground, and then things in the air. And then they eventually would be able to see the sun itself. So there are four basic stages then. First, there were the shadows and puppets inside the cave. Sorry, shadows of puppets inside the cave, cast by an unseen fire. Then the actual puppets and fire. Then the shadows of things outside the cave, cast by the sun. Then the actual things and the sun. So what does all that mean? First of all, the success of the Matrix movies is a testament to the truth, or at least perceived truth, behind Plato's cave analogy. That is, that the only reason that the Matrix movies are not regarded as just stupid is that we somehow have a feeling that there's more to all of this than what we see. And Plato is drawing on this as well. What the Matrix arrives at as the more is not the same as what Plato does, but they start from the same idea that there has to be more to all of this than what we're conscious of. So, what is the mechanism by which these images are produced, according to Plato? The cave allegory, as you know, comes at the very beginning of book 7. At the very end of book 6 is something called the divided line. And the cave is an illustration of the divided line. So if we want to understand how things occur in the cave, we have to understand them in terms of the divided line. And so here's how the divided line works. What Socrates says is, let's take a line and divide it unequally. One section represents the intelligible world. So that would be the world of forms, including mathematics, because numbers are universals. So if I say 3, that applies to innumerable triads and so forth. And then there's the visible world, the world of individual things. Then he says, let's divide each of those segments according to the same ratio as the first division. And so we get this. Now, you still have the intelligible world at the top and the visible world at the bottom. But now the intelligible world is divided into the form of the good and to other forms, which are images of the good. The visible world is divided into things, which are essentially copies of the forms. You know, as a mouse is a kind of copy of the species of mouse. And finally, images, shadows and reflections of things. So if you go from the bottom up, number 4 represents the images of physical things, the shadows and reflections, which the people outside the cave would see at first. Number 3 represents the physical objects themselves that the images were shadows and reflections of. And the relation between those two, that is the images and the things, is replicated in the larger division. That is, the images are images of the things, but the whole visible world is an image of the intelligible world. And within the intelligible world, the other forms which you get to know first, like we would know the species mouse before we would know the species good. The other forms you get to know first, and then you see that they are really images of something higher. I'll say more about that later. So here's how the two fit together. On the right is what we just looked at. On the left is the allegory of the cave, the 4 parts that I mentioned. So when I said before that the allegory of the cave is an allegory of the divided line, here you can see it. The shadows that the prisoners look at represent the images, like reflections of things. The puppets on the fire represent the things outside represent the forms, and the sun represents the form of the good. Now, in addition to the allegory of the cave representing the divided line and representing levels of reality, it also represents levels of knowledge. So there on the left is that diagram that you should be used to by now. And what I've done is on the left, I've put the levels of reality, which is what we've already looked at. And then on the right, the levels of knowledge that correspond to it. I won't go into any detail about this, but just starting from the bottom. Starting from the bottom, we start out with something that Plato calls imaging. It's the word in Greek is ekasia, and there's no obvious way to translate it into English. But what Socrates or Plato means by it is that this is our ordinary way of looking at the world, as opposed to the next level up, belief, which I interpret to mean understanding visible things by means of physical science. So most of us don't have any kind of a rigorous way of understanding the world. We just form general impressions and draw conclusions which may or may not be accurate based on the experiences we happen to have, what we happen to notice. But there's a higher level in what he calls opinion. And the higher level is understanding visible things by means of something like physical science. But it's all within the visible world, because that's why I use the adjective physical science. The assumption is that all there is the physical world. So there are two levels of the physical world, a casual way of looking at it and a more rigorous way. Now, when you get to the next level, which is the level of knowledge, the lower of the two is called reasoning, which is deductive knowledge of universals. And you don't have to understand this in detail now, but it's just that when you think of how geometry works, for example, you are given axioms and postulates, and you reason downward from them to conclusions. And that's deductive knowledge. The higher level is what is called understanding. And it's not deductive, but dialectical. And I can't get into that now. But it's a way of, instead of starting with assumptions and working down to see where they lead, it means starting with assumptions and then trying to derive them from something higher. And if you do that, you eventually end up with an understanding of the good, because that's the ultimate explanation for all things. Now, as I may have mentioned at the beginning, I have a full-length version of this talk as a paper with all of the illustrations. And I will send that to Roopen. So if any of you want to look at this stuff in more detail, well, there'll be two ways you can do it. One is that you can listen to the transcription of this, the recording of this. But if you prefer to have something on paper in front of you, as I do, you'll be able to do that too. Okay, so All of this leaves us with three questions. One, how can we escape from the cave? Two, how can the source of all things be the good when the world is such a terrible place? For example, some people get black eyes just before they're supposed to appear in a Zoom lecture. Number three, what does all this tell us about philosophy as a way of life? And that's, of course, why you're here. So we'll see what Plato has to say about this. So how can we escape from the cave? To escape from the cave means to understand reality in terms of universals rather than individuals, because that's the kind of knowledge the cave represents. How can we learn to do that? And this illustration is taken from Plato, from this section of the Republic. Suppose we look at three fingers: the pinky, the ring finger, and the middle finger. The ring finger is big in relation to the pinky, but small in relation to the middle finger. How can the same thing be both big and small? And the answer obviously is only in relation to something else, in this case, another finger. But what is a relation? First of all, it's a universal, because relations like bigger and smaller apply to innumerable things. So that means that once we understand that there is such a thing as a relation and that it's something real, then we are recognizing the reality of universals. So when people in the cave realize this, they awaken to the reality of forms, of universals. And it's interesting that a century ago, Bertrand Russell used relations to demonstrate the reality of universals as well in his very fine book, The Problems of Philosophy. It's a book that I recommend. It's a very succinct set of chapters which talks about the nature of what we can know and what's real. So that's how we begin to escape from the cave. Once we understand that there are such things as relations, and therefore there are such things as universals that are real, we can see that there is a kind of reality that is not visible, but is only perceptible by the mind. And at this point, and this is something I'll go through very quickly, it's a 6-step ascent from the cave. The first is becoming aware of universals like bigger and smaller. And numbers, this leads us to the idea of numbers. Bigger and smaller leads us to numbers, and therefore leads us to arithmetic. So the first step then is to study arithmetic and understand that numbers are universals because each number applies to many different things. And we know that numbers have a reality. They're not just figments of our mind because they work in the world. When you do mathematics, when you do arithmetic, and you say, I'm putting 3 things in a drawer, I'm putting 2 more things in the drawer. When I open the drawer, there will be 5. It works. So they're not only universals, but they are real. And the next from this is to learn plane geometry and solid geometry. Shapes are universals because each shape applies to many different things. There are an infinite number of triangles. And we know they have reality because geometry works in the world. So we've moved from abstract numbers to shapes, and now we're moving to shapes actually in space, astronomy. Heavenly bodies are solid shapes that manifest the laws of nature. And so when we study astronomy, we understand that there are laws of nature, and these are universals because every law applies to many different events. The next step, and actually the two are presented in this order, but at the same time, we're told they really are complementary. And harmony is the counterpart of astronomy. It reveals the nature of order and disorder to the ears, as astronomy does to the eyes. So when you listen to music, some sounds harmonize, others are disharmonious. And the reason for that, and this is something that Plato talks about in a dialogue called the Timaeus, has to do with wave frequencies. And so harmony tells our ears something about laws of nature, as astronomy tells our eyes. And this takes us to the final step, the highest stage of the divided line, which Plato calls dialectic. Now, I'm making a distinction now using the terminology that Russell uses, but it's certainly something that we all know about, that there are two basic kinds of knowledge: knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. And many languages have different terms for knowledge depending on which one you mean. Like savoir and connaître in French, for example. So knowledge by description, savoir, means you can learn by listening to what other people tell you. So science is learned by description. You can read books about science, and when you've read it, you understand it. But there's another kind of knowledge by acquaintance, connaître, which is something that you have to experience directly. So if you want to know what it was like growing up in my family, there's no way that I could make you understand that the way I understand it. You would have to have had that experience. If you want to know what it's like standing in Niagara Falls, you have to go there. No matter how many books you read about what it's like, you'll never know. So that's knowledge by acquaintance. Now, all of these other things are things which can be known by description. That's why they can be taught fairly straightforwardly. Arithmetic geometry, astronomy, harmony. Those are all things that can be explained clearly. But this final one, dialectic, cannot. And I'll give you a quote here. Socrates says he can't explain dialectic further because words are only images of the experience. In other words, words are knowledge by description. But when you actually experience dialectic, quote, you would no longer see an image of what we are saying, but the truth itself. So when you describe something to someone, you give them an image. But when it's knowledge by acquaintance, you actually see the thing itself, experience it itself. And the power of dialectic alone can reveal it to someone who is experienced in the things we just went through. And it is not possible in any other way. So ultimately, the escape from the cave isn't just to recognize universals, but to reach a level of understanding that can't be put into words. So when you understand what he means by the form of the good, that's not something you can just explain to someone. You can tell them how to get there, as he's doing here, but you can't give them words to create the same experience. So that's the answer to the first question. How do you get out of the cave? The answer to the second question, how can the source of all things be good when the world is such a terrible place? And there are examples, not only my black eye, but other examples too. There's COVID, there's climate change, racism, greed, and all kinds of violence. Even in Plato's day, there was the devastating Peloponnesian War, which destroyed Greece. There was a plague which killed many people. And there was the unjust execution of Socrates' beloved teacher, of Plato's beloved teacher, Socrates. So lots of terrible things are happening all the time. So what's the answer to that? How can the source of all things be good? Well, there are at least two ways. There are two basic ways to look at the world, at the level of individuals and at the level of laws of nature. So it's again something like the divided line. Individuals and universals. The laws of nature are good because they're rational. And as we've already talked about, rationality is good. So to the extent that the world is rational, it is a good place. Therefore, evils are a result of individual behavior, not the structure of the world or the source of things. So things like, to go back to the examples I gave before, racism, greed, and violence, it's not a result of the structure of the world, it's a result of human behavior. And this gets into the whole thing about free will, and that the only way that the world could have prevented people from behaving this way is to prevent them from having free will, and that not many people would want to say that would be a better world. So in other words, these kinds of evils are inevitable but not because the world isn't a good place, but because within that goodness is the possibility of freedom. So what about natural evils, like disease and natural disasters? Well, first of all, disease isn't an evil. It means that other life forms feed on us as we feed on other life forms. So we have bacteria and viruses that make us very sick and kill us. But that's not an evil. Those are just, it's a world full of life forms that survive by taking advantage of others. Natural disasters like earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, and we're seeing that around the world too. They're not evil. They're a result of seismic and meteorological activity. You have to ask yourself in all these cases, it's easy to say these things are bad, but you have to ask yourself, but what will you need to change to get rid of them? And would the world be better then? And in this case, what you would need to change is you'd have to have a dead world. That is, you'd have to have a world in which there's no more seismic activity, which there's no molten core. Then you wouldn't have earthquakes and floods and volcanoes anymore, but the earth would be dead like the moon. So the conclusion of all this is the world isn't the best that we can imagine, but the best that's possible. That's a phrase that was made popular by the 17th century philosopher Leibniz, who famously said, "This is the best of all possible worlds," by which he didn't mean everything is perfect. What he did mean, though, is that if you understood the principles from which all of these things arise, you would understand that to change any of these principles would only make the world a worse place. There's an essay of his in which he talks about this called On the Ultimate Origin of Things, if you're interested. So a lot of Leibniz is talking to people deliberately oversimplifying things, like in his famous book, The Theodicy. But you have to realize that there he's really not being sincere. He's trying to make his beliefs look more palatable to people. But that short essay on the ultimate origin of things is really where the heart of it is. Okay, so this takes us to our final question. And that is, what does all this tell us about philosophy of a way of life, as a way of life? If life is full of suffering at the level of individuals, but good at the level of reason, that is the level of universals like the laws of nature, then we should prioritize not our individuality, but our rationality. We should value a life of the mind over the life of the body. Now, that doesn't mean we can't enjoy the pleasures of the body, as long as they don't interfere with those of the mind. but where we have to make a choice, we should be willing to sacrifice the pleasures of the body.